We are on the air. Excellent. You are on the air with me, and I am continuing my, let me go back here and do this. It's live radio, folks. It sometimes is like making sausage. There we go. Tonight, what we're going to talk about is wide-ranging and I hope thought-provoking. Each time I speak with one of our guests, I learn just a little bit more, and each time it's my hope that we can help our audience understand the world around us, as well as give them a source where they can send people and say, well, you need to listen to this guy that Bill Zam had on last night or last week or last month or last year, because this guy knows what he's talking about. Now, if you know this show, if you've watched this show or listened to our audio broadcast before, we don't normally do fictional writers. But in this particular case, that is, we're throwing that out the window because this guy has a very solid background, and he is, I think, right on the money with a lot of his opinions, and he's going to tell us about that in just a few minutes. Now, I want to open this up by saying that I am a second-generation American. My mother's dad came here from Austria around World War I. The family over there wanted at least one male member to survive World War I and continue the family. My mother learned German before she learned English. German was spoken at home, but the rule was that English would be spoken outside of the home. The reason for this is that this is America, and we are proud to be here. So, that is my background in this. And I think, Michael, that one of the things that we want to be aware of when we're talking about this is something that's called the Overton window. And you mentioned that you hadn't heard of that before, so I'm going to go over what the Overton window is real quick. It can be applied to every social and political issue in the world. It was developed by a guy at the Mackinac Institute here in Michigan by the name, oddly enough, of Mr. Overton. Now, a lot of people that write blogs and conservative talk radio hosts are very familiar with this. Picture a rope stretched between two poles, and in that rope are knots tied at set intervals, say once every foot along the rope. The left side is left-wing politics and society, basically communism, socialism, that sort of thing. The other side is extreme right-wing. Now, take a picture frame and hold it in front of you, and you move it back and forth so you see one knot or another, and you can gauge at any one time in society where the political and social atmosphere in the country is by moving that picture frame back and forth. The picture frame is called the Overton window, so you can gauge where society is right now. The founders of the country set up the system to be one knot to the right of center, just a little right-wing or conservative policy. And I have some graphics right here. Let me pull up the graphics so that you can look at it. This is the Overton window. Incidentally, folks, if you want to see the video version of the show with no audio, open up a new tab and go to USSAMichigan.com. USSAMichigan.com. Click on the big red link at the top of the page, and it will take you to the video stream, which is showing right now a graphic representation of the Overton window, showing where the founders of the country originally set up the political and social structure of the country, so you can get a good grasp of where originally it was. Now, I believe that right now we are over here on this side of the Overton window. And that is one of the things that my guest and I are going to talk about. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce to you the author of Melting Point 2040, America Faces Divide, and the author, Michael Bushman. Mike, how are you doing tonight?
Good. Thank you very much for having me, and appreciate the opportunity to be with you and your listeners.
Excellent. I am so sorry that I took so much time there at the beginning, yammering away about my about whatever it is I was talking about. Now, your book, Melting Point 2040. Let's start with why you wrote the book and what you had in mind when you wrote it.
Yeah, and you made the point that you don't typically have fiction writers on, and certainly I can understand that. My writing is really driven by a policy bent. I decided, though, that I wanted to write fiction stories of where we're headed in the future if we continue down the current policy paths that we're on. Because I think it's important to use stories to help educate people on the implications of the various actions we're taking. It's very easy, and most people, certainly most elected officials, don't look at the implications of what they're doing beyond the next election cycle. I'm looking at the implications for my kids. If I have grandkids someday, I want them to live in a country that looks and feels a lot like the country that our founding fathers envisioned, with some of the improvements that have been made over time. And but my fear is that we're not headed there. And so I wrote the story really focusing on issues where I think both the Democratic Party and the Republican parties are missing the boat. And the reason I think they're both missing it is because the parties themselves have become more important in making policy determinations than the nation's best interest. So the Democratic Party is advocating issues that help the Democratic Party succeed, the Republicans doing the same. And so I picked a handful of issues: immigration, budget deficits, and just a small handful of issues where I think the party, and certainly campaign finance reform, where I think both parties are way off base. And the first couple of books really focus on the implications of the immigration debate. You've got Democrats who really have essentially been advocating an open borders approach. And they're not doing that because they think it's necessarily in America's best interest. They're doing it because it helps get new Democratic voters. First-generation immigrants tend to vote Democratic. Now that changes over time as immigrants assimilate into the culture. But, what it appears is that their interest is to get new immigrants hooked on government benefits and make them Democratic voters for the long term. Republicans have also been guilty, though, because and divided but guilty. So you've got a group of Republicans who have also been very supportive of open borders to drive labor costs down. So kind of the big business Republicans who want very low wage rates. High rates of immigration to be able to have a big competitive labor force. The other part of the Republican Party, though, I believe, has tried to be too restrictive on legal immigration. And what that meant is that over the last 20 years, we haven't allowed enough immigrants who wanted to come into the country legally to meet some of the labor force demands that, existed pre-2008. And what happened is those labor force requirements were filled with illegal immigrants. The illegal immigrants came in and don't have that same desire or ability to assimilate into our culture. They're not required, as they go down a path to citizenship, to learn the language, to develop the common culture, to help build the unity in the country that's so important to national survival.
Now, I know, not to get us off track, but it's a question that just occurred to me, and I wanted to ask it now. The illegal immigrants, what about when, and this is the big emotional talking point that everybody has, but I want your opinion on this. What about the illegal immigrants that come here to have a child, then that child becomes a United States citizen? Do they also follow the same path that the legal immigrants do, where they vote Democratic for a certain number of generations, or are they typically have the illegal immigrant mindset, whatever that is?
Yeah, I would say that at least from what we've seen of late, that first of all, they're not supposed to be able to vote if they're not here legally. So they shouldn't be able to vote unless they're granted citizenship. But under President Reagan, we had one amnesty provision where a number of people who were here illegally were granted amnesty. That's made it in the states where that amnesty had the biggest impact, states like California. What we've seen is big Democratic vote swings in some of those markets. And the expectation is that with immigration reform, you may have that same kind of phenomena. I happen to think that immigrants want the same thing that everybody else wants. They want a good life for their families. If they come here illegally or not, whether they came here illegally or not, they want that good life for their families. And if Republicans could outline policies and reasons why lining up with the Republican Party policies is in their best interest, I think they've got a chance to attract those voters over time. But that's clearly not what Dick Durbin and Chuck Schumer and some of the others who were involved in the Gang of Eight on the Senate immigration reform bill have in mind as their preferred outcome.
Well, the big question is, since we're on that topic, is why? Why are the Republicans doing that? Do you think they've sold over to the progressive politics?
No, well, I think there's a couple of different reasons. I mean, certainly from a humanitarian perspective, where you've got all these divided families, where because of laws that were made back in the 19th century, the law that if you're born in the United States, you can become a citizen, was essentially designed to make sure that the children of slaves post the Emancipation Proclamation wouldn't be denied citizenship. Since then, it's become very easy to travel. So it's very easy for somebody from another country to get on an airplane, land in the U.S., have their child here. We really need to revisit whether that law that allows you to be a citizenship when you have no connection to the country just because the child's born here makes sense anymore in today's environment. But so you've got these children who are citizens in many families and not the parents. And then, from a humanitarian perspective, I think a lot of people just feel in their gut that it's wrong to separate families. Now, it's not the U.S. government that's doing that separation. It's the parents who are making the decisions. But that still tugs at folks. There are certainly folks in the Republican Party whose drive to expand immigration and to reform immigration is a combination of recognition that you don't want a large group of people living within your borders who aren't citizens, aren't on a path to citizenship, aren't assimilating into the culture, are afraid to integrate into broader society because they don't want to be found and separated. And certainly for the longevity of the nation, you don't want big groups of people inside your borders who don't have the long-term interests of the nation as one of their priorities because they haven't sought and attained citizenship yet.
Now, what about the economy when you mix immigration in with it? What are the, historically, what are the immigration policies depending on the health of the economy in the United States at that particular time?
And that's really the key, is that, the current immigration reform and our prior immigration policies really had set numbers of immigrants that were going to be allowed in year by year. The reality is that number needs to fluctuate depending on the economic needs of the country. When you go through a recession, you need to be shutting off immigration for that period of time. And I know that seems harsh for people who are getting close. But then when the economy is doing well, you want to be able to expand immigration and accelerate and build on the economic benefits of having immigrants coming into our country. The U.S. has always been an immigration-friendly country. Most people don't realize, if they haven't studied history, how many times we've gone through real fundamental changes in who the people were within our borders. There was a time when the Irish came over, and you had no Irish need apply signs all over the nation where the Irish were, because they were considered a low class and weren't wanted by society. the Irish slowly integrated. Most people don't realize that the biggest mass lynching deaths in U.S. history were actually of Italians, who were a hated minority at one point in their integration into society. So we've always had people who came here who the culture didn't feel fit in. But what happened is, in the generations, the first and second generations, there was an encouragement to assimilate, to learn English, and as your family experience, to speak English outside the home, still respect that native culture and heritage at home, still honor it, still even participate in many of those traditions from your native country. But to recognize that being part of being an American is integrating into the broader society, and a key part of that is language. And I think one of the key points I think is critical, and there's a Stanford professor, David Layden, who, along with a number of other colleagues, has studied language policy and its impact on civil war. And what they found is that when nations get a minority language population that gets greater than 10% of the nation, particularly when that population gets geographically concentrated, the drive for that area of the country to secede and form an independent country grows. And if you look at just the last half of the 20th century, there were 127 civil wars fought around the world. 17 million people died. And the primary drivers of those were battles over language differences, religious differences, or racial and ethnic differences. So my approach in writing Melting Point 2040 and writing Secession 2041 was to tell a story of what happens if we allow ourselves to be segregated by language as well as being segregated along racial and other lines. Unfortunately, America is resegregating along a number of fronts over the last 15, 20 years, language being just one of those ways we are pulling apart.
So what are what do you think are the causes for us pulling apart? Because I've noticed it too. I am out and about. I used to, a few years ago, well, more like 10 years ago, I was a electronics repairman for a major corporation, and I traveled all over Michigan repairing machines and whatnot. So I had quite a bit of experience in just about every ethnic neighborhood, city, town, company, and I have noticed something since I was in high school, at least, maybe before, that ethnically we are separating rather than coming together. What do you think has muddled up our the great melting pot of the United States?
Yeah, and that's a really critical question. And I think if we look at the last 20 years, and there's an author, Bill Bishop, who wrote a book called The Big Sort that really kind of detailed some of the details behind some of this resegregation. But there's a couple of different pieces. I think a lot of it really comes down to political leadership within the particular communities. So if you look at the political leadership within the African American community, a lot of those political leaders don't have an incentive for African Americans to disperse in the broader society. It's better for them politically to keep them concentrated because it means that more there are bigger districts or they maintain their power base. Not all of our African American leaders are acting in a way that I would consider encouraging unity and integration. In fact, playing race baiting with some folks like Reverend Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson seems to be a fairly common occurrence these days, and really isn't getting called out by most of the mainstream media to the extent it needs to be called out. Because when you have that divisive political leadership, it's really telling people within a community, you don't want to go there. You don't want to live with those people because they don't like you. I haven't seen any evidence that there's a dislike or that there's any reason that we can't be integrated. So I think that you've still got that segregation and resegregation with the African American community, we're actually also seeing it among Mexican Americans. Now, ironically, it's not all Latinos and Latinas who are not assimilating. Many from South America are assimilating into the broader culture. You're seeing that with the people who are moving here from Spain and Portugal. But from Mexico in particular, we're not getting the assimilation levels that you would typically expect to see. And I think a driver for that is that there's enough of them who have entered the borders illegally and really don't want to be integrated into broader society for fear they'll be identified and sent back to their home country.
Do you think that the what is called the Reconquista effort would be something that would play a hand in this, specifically for?
Well, I do think it's interesting. If you look at demographic trends and where we're headed in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, and I believe that in the next 15, 20 years, you'll see California split in half as a state, so that South California becomes a largely Hispanic state, and then a little bit north of L.A., start to join into North California. The driver for that, in my view, will be that Democrats will see an interest in having two more solid Democratic Senate seats, and when they have the political power to make that happen, it's going to be difficult for them to resist the temptation to add to their political base. So you'll have four states: Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, South California, with well over majority Latino Hispanic population by the time we get to the year 2040. And by the way, the reason I picked 2040 as the year for writing Melting Point 2040 is that's projected to be the first year in which whites become the minority population within the United States.
Uh-huh.
So just that plus the fact that there's a presidential election that year, those 2 points coincided together to make it appropriate in terms of the choice for that being the year in which language separation issues and secession efforts kind of come to a quick head.
Okay, so obviously and I'm reading the book, folks. It is an excellent book. You got to get Melting Point 2040, and you'll just go ahead and buy the next book in the series because it is actually that good. It is I believe, a good history lesson, as well as Mike says, it is I think, a fairly possible accurate view of the near-term history of the United States in 2040. Yeah. It's kind of scary, but I mean, what are you going to do? It's the way things are going. What are boy, how do I phrase this? It's let me see here.
Well, maybe while you're thinking of how to phrase it, maybe if I can make one more point.
Yeah, go ahead.
If you look at Texas and New Mexico, Arizona, Southern California, most people don't realize that 150 years ago, those states were part of Mexico. So there is a desire within parts of Mexico, and certainly among Mexican political leaders, to be able to reunite the country as it once existed. And the reason that these states seceded from Mexico was because at that point there was enough European immigration into those areas that they became majority European origin population, majority Anglo states. We're very quickly getting back to where they are going to be majority Hispanic states, and at that point you're going to find political leaders, and political leaders are going to pop up who are going to use ethnic pride and self-governance as a real drive to support the political careers. We've seen that historically. We've seen it in countries around the world, and it's almost a certainty that it's going to happen here. It's just to what extent are they going to be successful?
Okay, so a two-part question here, or an observation on my part. I guess it's a question. The legal versus illegal immigration. What are the possibilities that the illegal immigration has that end goal in mind? Are there enough Reconquista supporters that are coming here illegally, do you think? Are they going to have enough volume to actually do that? And if they can't vote, how are they going to go about it? And the other thing that I wanted to point out is the video side of the show at ussamichigan.com. And this is a story from theblaze.com. It is from an Arizona sheriff. It is about an Arizona sheriff who says, Senator Rubio, you know nothing about our border. And this sheriff is very upset. It's in Cochise County in Arizona. And the important thing that I wanted to bring up is this. There's an 83-mile border, just 83 miles. If I drive from here to Detroit, that's around 50 miles. So, I mean, right where I live between Jackson, Michigan, and Detroit, that's about 83 miles right there. They have gone since the mid-1980s from 50 Border Patrol agents. Now they have 1,500 federal agents down there, and they still cannot stem the flow of illegal immigrants or the drugs coming up. So back to the original point, do you think that these illegals are part of the reason they're coming in is to facilitate the Reconquista of Mexico?
You know, I don't think that the individuals who are coming in here have that in mind. I think the vast majority, and I know some, I've run across them. I live in the Chicago area, and we certainly have folks who are here legally and some who will freely admit that they're not. They're coming here really because it's in their economic interest to be here. They're trying to make for a better life for their families. Now, can I say that there aren't political leaders inside of Mexico or political leaders in that community who see this as a positive? No, I'm sure that there are some people who are looking at it and kind of waiting and biding their time until they believe that they've got enough power that they can pull the trigger on it. But I don't think that that's the intent of the people coming here. The problem with our illegal immigration and not getting real border security, I have no problem with any immigrants coming here who come here legally, who come here and want to take part in our society. They learn about our culture. They learn English. They integrate into the broader community because while they may still always have ties back to that home nation, they may still always cheer for the Mexican soccer team or, for other teams in the Premier League. They will be just as American as somebody who came here from Europe or from Africa or from Asia. The problem becomes when you have people who come here and really don't make the commitment to be part of the nation. So, I was really optimistic when I saw the Gang of Eight negotiations on immigration reform that they would really understand that it's important to fix this problem once and for all, not to allow conversion to legal citizenship, but then not secure our borders. We have to secure our borders. And I've been hopeful that looking at the principles the Gang of Eight had out there, that they understood that. Now, what happened in the couple of months after the principles came out is we saw the legislative language, and then we heard Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano say that our borders are already secure. And that told me everything I needed to know about how serious the administration was going to take driving real border security. We have to secure our borders, and we have to do it for two reasons. We have to do it because we have to make sure that the people coming into the United States want to be citizens and want to assimilate into our culture. The other piece is that the radical Islamic terrorist groups have started to figure out that southern border is porous, and are starting to bring in use that relationship with the cartels that they are developing, Because after all, remember, many of them are also the drug suppliers to some of these cartels for some of the opiates that come out of parts of the Middle East. We have to worry about how those relationships are going to develop over time and how disruptive that's going to be and how disastrous it's going to be when you've got cartels and terrorists figuring out that working together they can be much stronger than they are individually.
Yes, that I agree with that. We did actually a 3-hour show last year about that, and I'm waiting for a website to come up now on the video screen there with some facts and figures about the Islamic terrorists that have come over our southern border. And I know for a fact that they have found Al-Qaeda handbooks and training manuals in the desert that apparently somebody dropped coming in. It's anybody's guess how many of these people are actually in this country now that mean us harm. How many, off the top of your head, just a wild guess, how many do you think?
You know, I couldn't even begin to guess, but really it only takes a handful. And you add that handful, and then you add some of the nuclear capacity that's being developed in Pakistan. You know, Pakistan already has nuclear capacity. Iran's trying to develop it. You're going to have other Middle East countries that are going to try and gain nuclear capacity. You put a small nuclear weapon that comes in through our border in the hands of a terrorist, and it doesn't matter that it's only one. Certainly the border's open for a lot more than one to get through if they want to do things beyond that. So, you know, I know it sounds like I'm being paranoid about what these threats are, but, you know, as a nation, the single most important piece that our founding fathers deemed our government responsible for doing was protecting the nation and its citizens. Defending the nation is the one proactive authority or actually mandate that the federal government was given. So if we're not securing our borders and providing for our national defense, that's the job they have to do first before anything else gets tackled.
And I'm reading here on a report about this that WSB TV2, don't know where they are at, where they're located. They published a population breakdown from an immigration and customs enforcement staging facility in Florence, Arizona. In 2010, they apprehended detainees from Afghanistan, Armenia, Bosnia, Egypt, Guyana, Iraq, Iran, Jordan, Kenya, Morocco, Pakistan, Sudan, Uzbekistan, Yemen, Bosnia, Turkey, and other countries. So this is what I would consider a clear and present danger to the United States. And the question is why haven't any of our elected officials, other than just a few brief mentions of it, Representative Bachmann last year for one, just a few brief mentions, and then it goes under the radar, and now we have the Gang of Eight doing the immigration thing, and I can't see how they're going to stem the tide of these non-Mexican foreign nationals coming over the border. Other than a fence, is there anything we can do?
Well, there's clearly a lot we can do from a couple of fronts. I mean, certainly there's the extending the fence and actually guarding it, as opposed to leaving big chunks of it completely unguarded, and then having big parts of the border that aren't even fenced off. The other piece is a lot of the illegal immigrants who are here just came in on visas and overstayed them. We don't have a system in place to track people who overstay their visas. They may be here on a student visa, and we have a big student population that's coming in from the Middle East. No solid system for identifying those folks and helping them to leave the country when they reach the end of their visa stay. To me, that's just an issue of willpower. It's not that the capabilities don't exist, that it couldn't be done if the government were intent on actually enforcing the laws as they stand, let alone making improvements to the laws. So To me, it's really just a matter of getting the political will, and it goes back to my statement kind of at the beginning that I think both political parties are to blame here because they're focused on the interest of what is to the advantage of political party growth as opposed to what's in the best interest of solving what's a real issue for the country. And before that's going to happen, before that's going to change, I think we really do need fundamental political campaign system reform, and likely with constitutional amendment components to that reform. We've got to shorten the election cycles. We've got to limit the percent of contributions any elected official can get from any source, including a political party, to something like 1/100th of 1% of their contribution. So our politicians don't owe their contributors anything. They owe their constituents their best work. And we've got to shorten the political cycle so they actually spend more time working on governing and a lot less time working on campaigning. These days you get elected in November, and before a new congressman or new senator even takes office in January, they've already started fundraising for their next election. There's never a point in which they stop and govern first. And when I worked in Congress a couple of decades ago, generally the first year of every 2-year session of Congress would be relatively bipartisan. I mean, people would work together. I think that all changed in the late 80s and early 90s, in part because of the success Newt Gingrich had in retaking the House. The lesson I believe the Democrats took away from Newt Gingrich's success was that not cooperating with the Democrats was the reason for success. They didn't recognize or couldn't appreciate that. I think the reason that the Republicans retook the House in 1994 is because they had better policies that year. But ever since then, both parties have believed that working with each other is contrary to their political interest. And who suffers for that? The nation certainly suffers for that.
Agreed. I agree with that, and I think the mainstream media has a lot of culpability in that because they obviously do not show both sides. And for the life of me, Mike, I can't figure out why that message does not get across, because we have so much alternative media on the internet now that has at least 50% of the population, with that point of view. So the question is why hasn't that type of communication that Newt Gingrich had, why hasn't that taken place? Or is it just because we don't have politicians on either side that have the guts to do it?
Well, I think there's a couple of issues. I think from a policy platform standpoint, the Republicans really haven't had a strong, organized policy platform. What Newt Gingrich outlined was kind of 10 points of how he wanted to change America. There's not really a consistent policy piece that we stand for equality, for example, in all ways. Neither party owns the equality argument right now. They aren't actively advocating for fundamental political campaign system reform as a party. Because they're focused on their short-term interests. I think what we really need is for either party to just start acting on the basis of fundamental principles that run in the nation's best interest, instead of trying to figure out how to game the system from year to year to figure out how they get a slight electoral advantage in the next election cycle, which is really where so much of the effort is going these days.
Well, here's a question for you on the Republican platform. In my opinion, they have essentially joined the Democrats in being a progressive party at this point. That's my opinion from what I'm seeing. The question is, who is out there in this country that could actually write this type of a platform? I would say similar to Gingrich, or I would prefer similar to Reagan's philosophy. Who is out there that can actually put this forward to write this? And the second part of this is, how did we get how the heck did we get so far away from Ronald Reagan's philosophy?
Well, I think there are actually quite a fair number of Republicans and even some Democrats who could outline policy positions that would make a lot of sense. What's interesting is you won't find the media covering those folks, and certainly not covering them in the way they search for people who are kind of at the edges of either party as the ones that they want to cover from a policy standpoint. So you've got a governor like John Kasich in Ohio, who I think is doing an excellent job, or Mitch Daniels in Indiana, or Scott Walker in Wisconsin. Ted Cruz is a very interesting person as a senator. Rand Paul has had some very interesting, and I think some very principle-based policies that he's advocated. Now, I don't agree with any of those people across the board, but I think they all have a very principle-focused center to how they make decisions about what they're going to do. And it's going to take somebody like that, and then, to be able to build a network of support within the Republican Party to have principle be the real driving force behind the party's positions. And, it's going to take some tough stands. And I think you raised the issue earlier that the mainstream media may not fairly treat all of these issues. I think one of the reasons people are very shy on this immigration issue is nobody wants to be called a racist. And the minute that you say that you're not for open borders, you have a group of people who want to call you out and say that you're being racist. Well, my philosophy is built around there's two things that we have to worry about. One is national survival, because if the nation doesn't survive, there's going to be some kind of war and a lot of people are going to die. And, I think we can all agree that's a bad thing. The other piece, and this is, I think, an important one for people to realize, is that across all of the major religions, there's one statement that unifies each of the religions. It's in the book of Matthew. Was spoken by Prophet Muhammad. It was spoken by Confucius. It's in Buddhism and Hinduism. Rabbi Hillel spoke it. The concept of do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. That golden rule really has to be the cornerstone of everything that we do, and I believe it's going to take a constitutional amendment to get that embedded into our public policy debates, to require that no law be passed that conflicts with the concept of doing unto others as we would have done unto ourselves. For example, take Obamacare. That would be thrown out automatically if we had that constitutional amendment because Congress exempted themselves from the law. You can't impose a law that you're not willing to live under yourself. That just de facto doesn't comply with the concept. So there's a lot of, we need some creative thinkers out there who will take a concept like that and really be very proactive about, here's some fundamental pieces that are wrong with society today that we have to fix. We have to take this golden rule. It's something that I think people from all the major religions understand. It's part of their religion. But an atheist could understand that the concept makes conceptual sense. And it's not a mixing of government and religion. It's just taking something that fundamentally makes sense and embedding it into our laws.
The constitutional amendment line of thought that you had there, I thought was very interesting. On the one hand, it sort of frightens me because God only knows what the Democrats are going to try to push through at the same time. Because you know how that goes. It's going to wind up being a 5,000-word amendment with all kinds of garbage built into it. I don't know if there's even any way to prevent that. But one thing that I heard a discussion today about the millennial generation, and that's the early 20s people right now, and possibly the generation just prior to it. They have been taught all of their lives that America is a place that once was. It's all over with. We have to go in a different direction, and yada yada. The question is, with a constitutional amendment, do you think that the education of the millennials and the generation just before them, do you think that they would be supportive of something like that on a social scale, the do unto others type of amendment to the Constitution? Do you think there would be enough support for that?
Yeah, I think there would be, because I think that while the millennials and my kids fit into that category, certainly make decisions differently. There's also, I think, a fundamental belief in decency and fairness that's built into their mindset. And nothing is more decent and fair than the idea that you do unto others as you would have done unto yourself. But it's going to take a political leader who's willing to go out there and, really stay focused and on message and really drive, here's the 5 things that we're going to get done. And these are all going to help build a better society and a fairer society. Not that, but what it's really doing is it's taking us back to the original intent that the Founding Fathers had. Unfortunately, I think while they anticipated a lot of what could happen to society under the Constitution, and they tried to put brakes on it and processes for the states to regain control, a lot of those have been usurped, and Congress is no longer actually protecting its prerogatives. So, when Bush was in power, the Republicans would allow the administration to issue executive orders that really should have required legislation, and they didn't hold them accountable by, cutting off their budget for some of the other activities they wanted to do. And now with President Obama in place, Harry Reid's not taking part in trying to protect congressional prerogatives. The founders actually wanted the 3 different branches because he didn't trust that too much power should be concentrated. And in fact, we're seeing the problem when that power gets overly concentrated and the branches aren't protecting the prerogatives that the Founding Fathers had embedded for them.
I think I'm scribbling down notes here while you're talking, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, 9/11 and the Patriot Act had a lot to do with the current situation that we're in and allowing the president to do willy-nilly executive orders all over the place. I think 9/11 damaged the psyche of the country, and we're still feeling the effects of this with Obama's executive orders and Bush's executive orders and all of these things. Do you agree with that, or am I wrong about that?
Yeah, I think it did. I think whenever you have a crisis or some kind of attack of that nature, it's the natural instinct of people to trade liberty for safety. And I can't remember which of the Founding Fathers. I want to suggest it was Thomas Jefferson, but I'm not. My memory may be off on that. Said that when you trade safety for liberty or liberty for safety, you end up getting neither. And that's in fact I think where we are finding ourselves, is that in the interest of trying to drive that added bit of safety, and yes, we'd all like it, but liberty has to be a key piece of it. And I think we saw an interesting example in Egypt just of late. It was just a little over a year ago that the Egyptian people voted to put Mohammed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood in power. As Morsi took control, the Muslim Brotherhood started to turn Egypt into a single religion theocracy, ignoring Supreme Court orders, issuing executive edicts that really contradicted what their mandate was from the people. The people then uprose. You had 30 million people in the streets out of the 90 million who live in Egypt demanding an overthrow, and the military came in and provided that for them. But what the people of Egypt told the government of Egypt is, yes, we want democracy, but we also want liberty. So we need, and that really should be what, as Americans, we should expect. We want democracy. We also want liberty.
Incidentally, as a side note, actually 2 side notes here, with this latest uprising in Egypt, There is a Christian church there that has Mass every day for the past 1,600 years, and this past week was the first time in 1,600 years that they have missed a Mass because the church was burned down in the rioting. I find that highly disturbing. The founding father that said that...
Ben Franklin. I see that up on the screen. That's exactly right.
For those of you that aren't watching on the video side, Ben Franklin said, "They that can give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." And I remember around 2001 with when they were doing the Patriot Act, I remember somebody, I think somebody on the radio or possibly on Fox News or something, quoted that and warned everybody of the dire consequences of the Patriot Act. And I believe they were exactly correct. Also in Egypt, let's stay on Egypt for a few minutes because you seem to have some very cognizant thoughts on Egypt that aren't making the rounds that I have been made aware of. Especially since, who was it? I think Mubarak was released from jail today.
Oh, was he released? Okay.
I believe so. I think I saw that on Drudge earlier.
I saw he was released but then put under house arrest.
Oh, that could very well be.
I'm not sure which of those is the latest.
Well, while you were talking about Egypt, I will check on Drudge.
Yeah, so what I think it's important to recognize America's interest here and why Egypt is so important. If you look through history and you look at the atrocities that have been generated from the Islamic Crusades that went from 634 to 1800, or the Red Terror in Ethiopia, or the Second Sudanese War, but it hasn't just been Islamic advances and crusades. Christian nations, when they've become single religion nations, have also engaged in efforts to broaden their control and authority with the 30 Years' War and the Crusades. There was a violent slaughter that took place in China led by Hong Xiuquan, who wanted to convert China to Christianity and proclaimed himself to be the brother of Jesus Christ. Somewhere between 20 and 100 million people died in that war. So religious wars that are when nations somebody tries to make a nation into a single religion nation, or when nations are godless. We've certainly seen it with the communists, with Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, with Pol Pot in Cambodia, that godlessness at the leadership level, or belief that by the leaders and everybody in the society that there's no higher being holding us accountable, also have engaged in some of the worst atrocities in world history. So when I look at those patterns that single religion nations create substantial atrocities, godless nations create substantial atrocities, it tells me that the Founding Fathers got the balance right of creating one nation under God, but then not allowing the formation of a national religion, which is what the First Amendment does, is it prevents the government from imposing a single religion on the country. So, it's important to have that balance right, and I think there's a drag that we are going too far as a society, pushing the belief in God and religion out of our society, when in fact that was never what the Founding Fathers intended. They just wanted to make sure we had that competition among the religions to constantly look for better ideas, and that religion really provides a counterbalance for government. If you don't have a group of religions who are questioning the directions and motives of the national government, there's really nobody holding national leaders accountable.
Do you think that, and this is, again, my opinion, do you think that the infatuation that certain sectors of the government have had with political correctness has in fact become the state religion?
Well, it's certainly. I think there's certainly an attempt to impose it. I mean, the way that people are called racist or are belittled in the national media for what seems to be fairly innocuous statements, or actions has really, I think, dampened the enthusiasm for just standing up for what we believe is right. And the way I tend to look at race issues, and I do this on religious issues, if I change the race of the people involved, so if I'm making a claim that somebody's doing something inappropriate and they're African American, if they were white, would I say the exact same thing? If they were Hispanic, would I say the same thing? I have to question myself, and I look to how would I change if I changed the race, or I changed the gender, or I changed the religion of the people involved? Would I react the same way? And I think if you look at the way the media behaves, they clearly behave differently depending on the religion or the race. If in Egypt the Islamic temples were being attacked, the way the Coptic Christian churches are being attacked, and the Coptic Christians were involved, it would be all over the U.S. national media. That's all we would be hearing about. We don't hear very much about how the Coptic Christians in Egypt are being attacked. And we have certainly plenty of examples of that within the U.S. borders.
And I would say that you've hit a very emotional trigger with me regarding the Christian churches in Egypt. As a matter of fact, I've found out over the past 24 hours that there are actual crucifixions of Christians going on in all over the Middle East, both in Egypt, in Yemen, and in other countries, where they're rounding up Christians and actually crucifying them. And I find that to be so unbelievably archaic and evil. Just evil. I can't think of any other word other than evil. I can, but I can't say them on the radio. I would say just plain evil.
It certainly is evil, and what's really disturbing to me is that the Muslim Brotherhood's actions should have been easily predictable, because they've always made clear that it was their intent to spread Islam through force. Now, it's interesting because, from what research I've done on the Islamic faith, in the Quran, it specifically says that conversions to Islam need to be done with the open heart of the person involved. That coercion is never intended to be part of the Muslim faith. That, of course, has not been the history, because you have men who run these religions who see it as in their self-interest to grow their follower base, and so forced conversions becomes a part of that. We really need the religious leadership to be very vocal about supporting and protecting religious diversity, but we need our president to be very vocal about the fact that it's inappropriate and just unacceptable to have the kinds of attacks that are taking place against Christians all around the Middle East. All of the single religion nations right now, by the way, are in the Middle East. So most of the Western world and many other parts of the world are support religious diversity, and ironically, even a country like China that was communist and anti-religion not too long ago, there's a fairly large growing religious movement across multiple religions that takes place there.
And you probably don't know this, Mike. Actually, there's no way you could know it. I started this show surrounded by idiots during the Arab Spring, and it was one of the catalysts for me getting back in front of a camera and a microphone after being away for a significant amount of time. And I was playing interviews that the Muslim Brotherhood leaders were having on the media in Egypt over the airwaves. Anybody could see this. It was common knowledge that that was their goal. That was the Muslim Brotherhood's goal, and they were elected anyways. And it brings me to the point that I made, is that pure democracy is nothing more than mob rule. The biggest mob is the one that gets to rule. And I think that's what we saw in Egypt, and it appears that the military is taking corrective action. So what do you think the end result is going to be after the military gets done with whatever it is they're going to do?
Well, I really hope that what they will do is go back to democracy, but democracy with liberty, where a constitution is in place that has religious freedom, free speech. Some of the fundamental pieces that are embedded in our Constitution, I think, are fundamental human rights and should apply in all of these countries. So if they can embed that in the Constitution, and whichever government will follow that and not try and eradicate those liberties once they are in power, then Egypt can return to a democratic nation, I think, fairly quickly. But it's not; they're certainly not easy transitions. Ironically, one of the reasons that I think the Muslim Brotherhood was so successful is for most of their 80-something year existence, they were really a social service organization, or acted that way within Egypt, providing food and other kinds of physical need support to the people of Egypt during the Mubarak regime. So they built a lot of goodwill up doing that. Interestingly, in Melting Point, I have a social service agency that's linked in and that actually gets supported through the cartels. That is one of the that becomes one of the compelling agents for the secession move. That they have built up that goodwill among the people. They've built that leadership, and to see it playing out the way I projected in Melting Point, seeing that that's how it has played out in Egypt, only adds to my belief that that something like this could happen here as well.
Actually, I have that portion of your book up on the video stream at USSAMichigan.com, along with my note, which you have just answered. I had a question that goes, is there a group that resembles H2M? Can there even be one with the drug cartels committing so much violence along the border? And I believe you just answered that. One last question on the Muslim Brotherhood and Egypt before we go into your book, because I want to talk about your book because it's so darn good. Say the military gets done with their crackdown, and they stand back and say, okay, everybody, here's the starting line, ready, set, go, have elections. And the Muslim Brotherhood gets elected again. What happens then?
Well, yeah, I don't think the Muslim Brotherhood would get elected again because they showed their hands. I think they showed that they would push beyond what the people had believed that they would do once elected. Now, if that were to happen again, then I think the best thing that America can do is try to ensure that the people of Egypt become our priority, not a relationship with the government, but building a closer relationship with the people. And in fact, I think that ought to be most of our foreign policy advocacy, is to build goodwill towards America and Americans by, helping people with, their basic needs, instead of routing all of our money and support through governments where it gets funneled into the fingers and bank accounts of a select few. We would be far better off doing things that actually help to build the education system, or provide basic food support, or help address crisis recovery in the event of a flood or a hurricane or whatever in each of the different countries that we want to interact with. That we really need to think about our foreign policy as something other than building a relationship with a couple of key people inside a government.
That makes a lot of sense, and since it makes a lot of sense, I suspect that will never happen.
I keep hoping somebody that it's not just making sense to me. So I'm glad to hear that you think it makes sense as well.
It makes all the sense in the world. Look what we did with. For all of my life, Mike, that I have been proud to be an American because when a disaster happens, when there's an earthquake, when there's a tsunami, a typhoon, a hurricane, anything, who's the first one there with all of the help? That would be the Americans. It's been that way all of my life. We send in our military with water and food, and we do. They send C-130s or C-5s over, and they just drop pallet after pallet after pallet of food. And we send in, military advisors. We send in the Peace Corps and everything else. And it just seems like we have gotten so far away from that. It's just, I'm sure that those groups are still doing that, but we don't hear about it anymore. All we hear about is the politics of the situation, and it has become front and center. And I think that is the number one thing that has destroyed our reputation across this planet.
That's absolutely critical. Building our Peace Corps, building, our connections with various countries, building those personal relationships is a key part of not just helping the rest of the world to improve their living standards, but to build a relationship between people in other parts of the world with us. I had the good fortune of working for global companies and spent a fair amount of time traveling around the world with the last company I worked for, meeting with folks all around the world. There are great people in every country, and it's really exciting and engaging to work with people from all parts of the world. But you have to have personal relationships to be successful. When you don't have that interaction, they don't know you. It takes time to build trust, and you just have to interact to build that trust.
Yes, we're both on the same wavelength there. Let's get on to your book for the rest of the show, because I think it's actually a magnificent piece of writing. I have one question I had for you. Are these your first books that you've written?
These are my first books. I started my career working in Congress. I worked for a Southern Illinois Democrat for 6 years, ultimately running his office in Washington.
Uh-huh.
Then had our first child and decided I needed to leave Washington if I was going to be anything approaching a decent parent, and went to work for the next 20-something years for Quaker Oats, and then a company called Nalco, which is a global water treatment company.
Uh-huh.
And, I wouldn't say that most people would look at having their companies bought and sold 4 times as a good thing. But that happened enough to me that I knew that I couldn't plan on spending the rest of my life and working inside a company, and I always wanted to write books. So when we got bought the last time, I took the opportunity to embark on this new career path.
Okay, that's an interesting story. I commend you for getting out of Washington, D.C. For the sake of your family. You have my utmost kudos on that.
I saw enough of what happens to people when they spend too long in D.C. We always half joked when I was there that if you didn't leave by the time you got to year 6, you were a lifer. And the unfortunate thing is that I think our lifers in Washington really lose touch with the rest of the world. It's not that they're not good people, they're not trying to do the right thing. It's that they really don't understand how the rest of the world makes decisions and acts and interacts, and being in a place where your word is your bond is not something they see day to day.
And they don't practice it either. Your book,
not often.
Yeah, describe the plot line of the book to bring the audience up to speed before we get into any specifics about it.
Yeah, so the plot line really starts with 2 characters. The first is a high school senior, 18-year-old Mexican immigrant whose mother moved him alone from Mexico to try and give him a new start in a town called West Nogales, Arizona, which, Nogales, Arizona exists, and I think Nogales is going to continue to expand. So Juan Gonzalez is the name of that character. He's really a brilliant kid, very confident. but has decided that as his second language, instead of learning English, to focus on Mandarin. And when he goes to try to find employment, because his English is not as fluent as it would be if that had been his second language, he's denied employment. So starts a Spanish-only language requirement drive in the state of Arizona, and quickly gains some a very large following. Then kind of his counterpart is a kid named Pete Root, who grew up playing an awful lot of video games, including a survival online video games. And so, I deal with technology to some developments to some extent. I think we're going to get to the point where these video games, where you're hooked up, your floors are moving, your walls are moving, your visuals surrounding you. You really have almost a home-installed game combat system, and that you're able to, and that the systems will be set up so that you actually feel like you're being knifed or shot when you're in combat mode. And Pete becomes that guy. But he goes and tries to find work after giving up on when he finally runs out of his welfare, and finds that he can't get work in the Denver area because he doesn't speak Spanish. And at many of the places where somebody with his background could work, Spanish is the mandated language of choice. So the two of them then come together over a period of time. Juan becomes a very important leadership figure within the Hispanic community. And then when Honor to Mexico, this social service organization that has some cartel backing, starts to drive toward the secession move, he plays a critical role in that. Through it all, I have a University of Chicago professor, and University of Chicago is where I did my MBA work, and I got my degree there. So that's the reason that was the school chosen. But I have students who come from different perspectives, who kind of argue out the policy pieces as this story is developing around them. And I want readers to understand that it's very natural. If I move to the United States and nobody makes me learn English, and I can get by, and in fact, we have gotten to the point where in Pima, Arizona, a woman was suspended from the community college as racist for asking that the nursing class be taught in English. If you come from that background, it's easy to understand why you would not want to have to assimilate. But as a nation, for our survival, we have to insist on it. So the story really develops around these characters and how they interact and how their stories overlap, and then ultimately involves national policy battles, and there's certainly some violence involved. I do my best to avoid using language that I wouldn't use in my daily life, even though there are probably times where some of the words that might be said might be a little bit more vulgar, but I wanted this to be something, I wouldn't be embarrassed for my younger nieces and nephews to pick up as well.
That's something that it just occurred to me while you were saying it. I'm about halfway through the book, folks. I'm on page 151, and when I started the book, it seemed fairly interesting, but I'm hooked on it now, so now I got to get the next book after this one. But that is something that I noticed without noticing it, is that Mike doesn't use gratuitous violence or bad language in the book like you see in a lot of other books. It's, I would say, grammatically, you write very similarly to the science fiction writer Larry Niven, because he almost never uses any type of swearing word, just a few damns and hells here and there. But he gets his point across without using the gratuitous violence, with the head exploding and the brain splattering all over the place type of a thing. It's just a description of what happens, and it leaves you to fill in the blanks with your mind's eye.
right. And I tried to do that so that the reader could fill in what came naturally to them, as opposed to me, using something that might be offensive.
Yeah, and it's a good book. Professor Stark is the professor in Chicago, and I've kind of sort of become a fan of his by reading the book. He's seems to be quite a character. Was he based on Professor Layton, by any chance?
No, because I've actually had some short discussions with Professor Layton, but I never actually served under him, even though he did teach at the University of Chicago at one point. But Professor Stark's kind of a agglomeration of a number of different people that I had a lot of respect for. And one of the keys to me is that he really holds students accountable. He demands a lot. He uses the Socratic method, so you can't just hide in his class. If you aren't prepared, he's gonna tear you apart. If you make an argument that's nonsensical, he's going to call you out on it. He's not going to let you get away with it. And I think that that's actually something that's really important in our education system, is that education be challenging. It's not all about people being happy. It's about people being developed. And that's one of the things I really wanted the character of Professor Stark to drive, is how do you push people to excellence without driving them away from pursuits that they should enjoy.
Well, the way you wrote his interactions with the class, I've got a couple of pages up on the video side right now, was quite good. I have to wonder whether or not the guy would be allowed to teach with his methodology, but I assume that he has tenure in the college in Chicago at this point in the book.
In this case, I think a real driver is, in one of the early history pieces, he is the driving force behind a constitutional amendment to reform our political system. So he is given leeway that he might not typically have to teach the way he wants to do, and he's become such a powerful figure within the nation that he attracts the best and brightest students. So he does get away with a little bit, especially for a guy who teaches in Barack Obama Hall. And since the University of Chicago was Barack Obama's home, I have no doubt that we're going to be looking at a Barack Obama Hall. I had one of my Democratic colleagues who started to read the book go, boy, I saw Nancy Pelosi International Airport is the name of the airport in San Francisco. And so I'm looking forward to reading the rest. And as I'm looking at that, as I was talking to him about it, I said, the reason I suggested that's going to be the name of the airport is because I think that's going to be the name of the airport in 2040. She's the first female speaker. She's beloved in San Francisco, so no matter what the damage she's done to the country, she's going to get an airport named after her, and the San Francisco airport's not named yet. So I tried to, be objective in where I believe the world's going to be at that point.
I got the being objective part when I called Mike last night to do our pre-production interview. We talked for a while, and reading the book, I mean, it's so you're taking both sides, and that's really good. You're taking both sides of a situation that I think we both think, and a lot of people think, could actually come to pass. And before I called you, it's like, was this guy a liberal or is this guy a conservative? I don't know, one way or the other. I said, oh my God, I hope he's not like a really left-wing flaming liberal, and this is going to be a really bad show. As it turns out, you're just like a regular person that I talk to on a daily basis. Now, in your book,
I mean,
go ahead.
I wanted to make the arguments for both sides because there are some legitimate, given different people's perspectives, you have to understand that there are legitimate reasons to feel that people feel the way they do. And I wanted to make sure that those were portrayed appropriately so that, I never like to win an argument over somebody who's not using all of their weapons. I'd rather win the argument when they've got all of their best arguments against me laid out on the table as well.
Yeah, it's pretty pointless when it's you're a fool. No, you're a bigger fool. No, you're a bigger fool. Type of arguments that we see so often. In the book, you had a Supreme Court decision, the California Del Sur or Sanchez case, and you obviously this is fictional and it may or may not happen, but you were talking earlier how you think it's a distinct possibility that California will be split into two states. And Professor Stark in the book, in the college class, he was talking, he was comparing Brown versus the Board of Education with the Supreme Court deciding to split California into two parts. And I think, even though it's fictional, that would be a excellent discussion point, if you could go into your thinking a little bit about that.
Well, part of my thinking is that I think we need to be a race-neutral, ethnicity-neutral country. And Brown versus Board of Education, I think was a very appropriate Supreme Court decision, came to the right conclusion that segregation is not a good thing for the country. But then you look at how the courts have interpreted the Voting Rights Act and the creation of majority-minority congressional districts, where we are essentially saying we're going to segregate our political world by race, and we're going to segregate it by party. One of I think, the fundamental political flaws in our country is that we have our maps of our legislative districts designed by politicians who are essentially picking who they want to represent them. And because of that, there's less fear among politicians that they're going to have to represent a broader part of society. So, to a Danny Davis, who's a congressman from the west side of Chicago, he's pretty comfortable. He's always going to represent a majority African-American district. So issues that are, that don't really appeal to that district or that aren't cornerstone in his district, he doesn't really care about. Likewise, you might have somebody from a, further suburban district who's pretty sure that they're never going to have some of the inner city issues, be something that matter to their constituency. So I think one of the fixes that I think is really critical for the country is to get away from having legislatures drawing politically motivated maps. And, we have computers now. We can randomly pick a house within a state through a random drawing and have the computer to draw contiguous districts from that without any political intervention. So party doesn't matter, race doesn't matter. It's just shifting, and that will do a couple of important things in my mind. One is it'll make politicians more receptive to focusing on solving problems and working with people beyond the community they represent at that moment, because their district could shift at some point in the future and they have no control over how that's going to shift. And I think that's an absolutely critical piece. The other piece that's really important about that is just to get away from politicians deciding who they represent, so that it's the voters electing our representatives, not the politicians deciding who they want to work with. The one potential risk with that is, what happens if we suddenly have a drop in the number of Hispanics or African Americans or Chinese or Indians who get elected to legislative office. I think if the districts are drawn on a compact, contiguous basis, you're going to have a certain number of minority districts. But if you also look at voting trends, whites are the group most likely to vote for people who are outside of their race. You get more race-driven voting within the African American and Hispanic communities today, where whites seem to be much more willing to vote for people of a different race. I don't think we have that same race issue that we clearly had when the Voting Rights Act was passed, and where, I'm not so sure that it didn't make sense then. I think 50-something years later, we are at the point where we can disband those majority-minority congressional districts and just elect people to represent Americans with no regard to race.
I think it's certainly worth giving it a try and see what happens. Maybe do it for a couple of decades.
We find out that it didn't work, we can go back and fix it.
That would be an adult thing to do. In the book, the page that I have up on the video side right now, it's the one that talks about Brown versus the Board of Education and the California Del Sur splitting by the Supreme Court. And on that page, you actually bring up Professor Layton's Civil War discussions.
Yep.
And I'm wondering, it kind of tickled my brain sitting here and listening to you talk about this. If some of the states are split up, do you think that would precipitate a civil war? And don't give away any plots of any upcoming books. But do you think that would, in your opinion, do you think that would lead to a civil war or at least border skirmishes or something?
I don't think so if they're done through discussion and through over a period of time. The real risk to me is that we have the conditions develop for secession and not have an active dialogue over whether it makes sense or what are all the pros and cons, because when an issue like that comes up suddenly, then there's always violent conflict. North Colorado, there are several, I think it's 7 counties in northern Colorado that are contemplating pursuing a secession effort from the rest of Colorado. The last time a new state split out of an old state was when West Virginia seceded from Virginia during the Civil War. I don't see that happening or being allowed to happen by the federal government unless you've got a politically aligned leadership in the House, the Senate, and the presidency who see long-term political advantage from allowing it to happen. In the case of northern Colorado, the Democrats are never going to let North Colorado segregate from the rest of Colorado because that practically assures 2 Republican senators in the North Colorado area. And, as long as Democrats control one body of the legislature or the administration, that's just not going to happen.
Yeah, the political expediency of allowing a civil war to happen is what disturbs me. In the book,
yeah.
There was one part that I enjoyed especially because it actually has been someplace that I have been. When my first wife, her father, he was the head of the heavy equipment garage over at the University of Michigan. And he used to take us to some of the greatest places. He used to take us out to some of the best restaurants that I have ever eaten and that he used to find with all of his buddies after he retired and went bumming around southeastern Michigan, all of these great restaurants. And one time he took us to a place that had been closed, but it has since been bought and reopened because it's so productive. And that is the salt mine in Detroit. And at the time, we were on the very last public tour of the salt mine. And, they take you down in the elevator, and they have actual full-size dump trucks down there. I mean, really full, the giant things that you see in the strip mines. And they took us around in this great big, Jeep thing that had 20 seats in it. And the ceilings in this place are 20, 30, sometimes 50 feet high, and it is just so roomy and big, and it's not like a coal mine, is that it's not dirty, it's very clean. And I've been down in there, and your book has a lot of parts of the book, chapters about the Detroit salt mine and what one of the Mexican drug cartels are doing. Talk about that. I'm showing some pictures of the Detroit salt mine. They're kind of distorted because they were small pictures to start out with, but you can probably through the online stream you can probably see what the photograph is about. Go ahead and talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think border security. I think at least at a public level, we all know we need to improve our border security. So what's going to happen if we improve our southern border fencing, we improve how we handle people who do visa overstays? The cartels are going to need another way to be able to get their drugs in. Terrorists are going to be looking for other ways to break inside our borders. And I think deeper and deeper tunnels are going to become a key piece of their strategy. So, tunnel technology is advancing. There's some new compression drilling technology where you're basically compressing the dirt and rock around the tunnel, and you're not having to extract as much up through the surface, which is, generally where you're going to most easily, from a satellite perspective anyway, be able to find tunneling work happening, basically through the movement of all that. So, looking at tunneling technology, how it's developing, and cartels already are using tunnels as part of their drug distribution effort and even their human trafficking efforts along the border. Right now a lot of it's on the southern border, but one of the ways to deal with that is to work is to open up some northern border alternatives as well. The Detroit salt mine, I picked that as a location for part of the book, largely because it's very close to the Canadian border. It's deep enough that you dig through there and get under the lakes and get up into Canada if you wanted to use that as one of the tunneling efforts between the U.S. and the Canadian border. So that was the reason I ended up with the Detroit salt mine. I think it's interesting that you chose that, or that you've been there. But tunneling, and I set some of the action to take place there because I wanted people to understand that this technology really is something that isn't going to be very far away from being able to be used for something other than salt production.
What I just circled there is it's actually one of the trucks that they took us on the tour, right there on the screen right now, and you can see exactly how roomy it is down there.
Yep.
It's an amazing place. I love going down there. I try to take photographs. I'm a photographer too, a trained photographer, and there just wasn't enough light down there. These photographs obviously have a very long exposure time to them. But that's what the main corridor of the salt mine looks like. I mean, look at that thing. It's huge down there. They got all of these electrical conduits that go down through there to power everything. So what he's talking about in the book, where they make a secret tunnel to the Canadian side, is quite possible because part of the salt mine, I believe, right now is underneath Lake Erie. I remember the tour guide telling us that right now we're below Lake Erie, which is very interesting.
It could certainly be done, and it would be very easy to restrict access to, an area within the salt mine to be able to hide it, to run illicit activities. And with as much product as comes up during salt production, you can easily hide weapons and drugs and other things inside that mine distribution effort.
And over here on a Wikipedia page, they are talking about secret passages, and specifically the biggest drug smuggling tunnel ever found was beneath the United States and Mexican border. And apparently they were taking absolutely vast quantities of marijuana and other drugs between Mexico and the United States. And you see there on the video side, there's a picture of one of the trap doors that goes down to the thing and everything. And in the book, you've got a drug cartel that has branched out into legitimate businesses, much like the mafia. Is that happening right now, or is that something in the future?
No, it's something that some of them are trying to do right now. Most of the cartels appear to be caught fighting with each other. But as soon as one of them gets enough of a dominant position that they're less worried about fighting with each other and more worried about how to expand. And one of the technologies that I have is enabling that for the cartel. Is something that I also think is going to come affect our day-to-day life. It's the technology that will enable the cartel to identify where all police vehicles are on their distribution routes and be able to avoid them through using a combination of satellite and police, electronic tracking means. That system gets built in conjunction with software that will start running our cars. So I think you get 20-something years out with the environmental controls that are being in place. I could easily see us being required to be in vehicles that we don't control. We tell it where we want to go, and it finds the most fuel-efficient way to get us there, particularly as highways start to get crowded, to be able to get us there is on a fuel-efficient basis, but also to make sure that we're maximizing the number of vehicles that can fit on existing highways without needing to build more. So using that kind of technology, the cartel, the Sinaloa province cartel, and there is a big Sinaloa province cartel today, but I have them using that technology to gain a distribution advantage and using that to help consolidate their power among the drug distribution community and become so profitable that they're able to start buying mining companies and other organizations, just as you mentioned, just as the mafia had done, just as you see with some of the Russian crime families and some of the other crime communities. They very often have legitimate business sides, and there may be legitimate business components to the cartels today, but I think that's just going to expand as time goes on.
And I'm sitting here thinking about how that automotive technology could come about. You already have the Google self-driving cars. You have your GPS. You have Mercedes and Audis that are capable of braking by themselves and accelerating by themselves. A lot of different cars now, you have adaptive cruise control where you set it and it maintains a distance from the traffic around you. So all the components are there. It's just a matter of melding them all together with the GPS and the tracking and everything else.
There, and it'll start with one of the cities that has some kind of federal smog control mandate requiring that in order to use their roads, you have to use a software system that dictates your driving so it gets you there the most fuel-efficient way as opposed to whatever way you want to do. And so we'll be essentially giving up control of how we move, first within some of the urban areas, but I think it'll expand fairly rapidly. My concern with that becomes if government wants to overextend its control and move a dictatorial direction, our ability to escape and to not be found goes down with each piece of tracking and control that we've turned over.
That's I could see it happening without too much trouble. The only thing that I could see is difficulties in extreme rural areas and winter weather. I mean, how's the computer going to react to snow and ice and mounds of snow on the side of the road and everything? So it would be, I think it would be buggy at first, but I mean, at least down south where there isn't any snow, I would think that it would be a distinct possibility, especially in the Los Angeles area.
Yeah, I mean, when we look at this being starting sometime 20 years from now, and we know that the components exist today to be able to do it, I don't think it's a stretch to believe that this could happen.
Yeah. Also in the book, you have a chapter where it looks like Professor Stark and Juan are in they're either on a TV show or in front of the Congress, and you had a big discussion about the First Amendment right of free speech, and you managed to meld that in with the Spanish requirement in that they were talking about doing. What state was that? Texas.
Yeah.
Okay. Talk about that. The First Amendment right of free speech with the requirement to speak a certain language.
Right, and the argument there isn't necessarily that I agree that this is together, but I wanted to present the position the way I would argue it if I were trying to protect, being able to speak another language. You could make the argument that the right to free speech, you can broadly define that in a number of different ways. Unfortunately, it's narrowly defined that apparently we can't criticize our government without being deemed, a real risk. But if you consider that you come into the nation, you speak Spanish, you're in a state that, or in an area that everybody around you speaks Spanish, I think you could make a legitimate argument that the right to free speech enables you to be able to speak whatever language you want. And I think we'll eventually see court cases that try and make that connection. I don't happen to think that, in fact, I'm sure that's not what the founders had in mind. But you never know how courts are going to settle that, and that largely is going to depend on who the judges are on the courts when we get to those issues.
I believe I understand where you're coming from on that. It sounds like a really sticky situation. And, of course, the politicians on both sides will weigh in with their learned opinions, depending on who's paying them the most at that particular time. If something
Go
ahead.
I was just going to say it will, of course, be driven by self-interest the way they weigh in.
Yes. How many pages do you think that piece of legislation will be?
Oh, geez. I really want to, and in fact, when I've talked about the do unto others as a constitutional amendment, if that can't be done in 2 or 3 sentences, something's wrong. So our laws have gotten way too complicated, way overstretched, to the point where typical everyday people can't understand what are our obligations as citizens, how do we comply with the law. When we lose that ability to understand what we're supposed to do to be good citizens, I think that's really damaging for the country. So we've got to fundamentally reform that whole regulatory and legislative system and really get down to some common sense. Here's what you need to do in a nutshell, and so that we can all understand how we're supposed to behave.
Yes, and
really that nutshell was the Constitution and the Bill of Rights.
Yeah, the First Amendment to the Constitution is only a few sentences, and it's perfectly understandable. Government's not going to start a religion, and everybody has the right to say whatever they want. And it just it very short and sweet. And these days, it would probably equal 3,000 or 4,000 pages. And what you just said about the requirements and responsibilities to follow the laws and everything, it brings up in my mind a whistleblower from the NSA. His name's William Binney. And he was asked a question in an interview on RT television about, a lot of people say that, I'm not breaking any laws, so why do I have to worry about anything like that? And his point, I think, is very telling. He says, you don't get to decide what you've done wrong. The government gets to decide that. You might think you're not doing anything wrong just by sitting there, but the government is the one that decides that. You don't have any say over it. And I think we've gotten to that point, and I think that's part of the problem.
That is part of the problem, is that society needs to define right and wrong, not the government.
Yeah, and we've gotten to the point now where the government is actually the ones that are deciding it. In your book, let me see, Professor Stark, I think is his name. Yep, Professor Stark. And he's in before Congress, and there's a Chairman Henry there. It brought to mind his speech that he gave to this congressman and what he said there. It reminded me a lot of the Iron Man 2 movie where Tony Stark was in front of the Congress and basically sort of said the same sorts of things. Were you thinking of that when you wrote that part?
I was not, and I don't even know that I had seen Iron Man at that point. But that's interesting. I'm going to have to go back and look at the movie, and I think I know the scenes you're talking about, but I'll have to go back and look at it. with this in mind.
It's the Iron Man 2 movie. That particular scene is hysterical. And I was just reading this when they're in front of the Congress last night. I said, it's Professor Stark, so you got Tony Stark.
Yeah.
So I made that parallel in my own mind. We just have a few minutes left in the show. What else do you want to tell the folks about the book and your plans for any future books?
Yeah, I think a couple of key things. For anybody who's interested in staying in touch, I have a Melting Point 2040 page on Facebook. On Twitter, I'm at M_Bushman, Bushman. And I have a blog at www.mbushman.com, so mbushman.com. And I post on the blog a lot of more of my policy perspectives. There's links to the books and some of the materials there, but it's really kind of an updated, more policy-oriented pieces there. To me, the key in writing these books is I think we need to reach people who aren't interested in policy. And so one of the reasons I wrote the books this way is to write interesting stories that hopefully will expose people to policy in a way that they'll then go and dig into those issues a little bit more themselves and come to their own conclusions about what's right and wrong. But I think the biggest problem is people who aren't thinking about it at all. It's not whether you're right or wrong on the issue. It's if you don't think it's important to worry about the direction of the nation. I think that's the biggest threat that we face.
Yeah.
So, for me, it's writing books. Other people might do movies. I think your radio show is an important way to reach out and attract people and expose them to different ideas. We're going to have to win the kind of mass media wars, which, the Republican Party certainly is getting destroyed in there. They're not winning the battles in the movie houses or in music or in books, and let alone in the political arena. So I think these issues all need to be discussed in all of those different forums, and I just happen to write. That was something I've always done. So for me, this was the outlet that I focused on.
Now, Blog Talk's going to cut us off in a few minutes, but I'm at your blog right now, mbushman.com, and right there on the front of your blog, apparently some words that you wrote were deleted by CNN. You are now my hero for being able to achieve that.
Yeah, I was flabbergasted, because here's what I wrote that they decided needed to be deleted as offensive. I wrote, "The fates of the U.S. and Mexico are intertwined. We must defeat the drug cartels, who otherwise will eventually combine, strengthen, and wreak even greater havoc on our society. It will get even worse once radical Islamic terrorists figure out how to team up with drug cartels to attack us." I couldn't figure out why that was offensive. I've certainly seen people on CNN and other public places who've said some outlandishly racist, obnoxious things. There are radical Islamic terrorists who are trying to hurt us. There are drug cartels who are trying to hurt us. We have to pay attention to these, and I think the statement that our fate as the United States and the fate of Mexico are intertwined, I think it's very clear. Mexico, is damaged as much by the strengthening of the drug cartels as the United States is. It's very disruptive, and it makes it very difficult. And in fact, I think it's one of the contributing factors to why there are a number of Mexicans who moved to the United States is to escape some of the violence in those communities. I just couldn't figure out why it got deleted. And then ultimately what I decided is that maybe they were just thinking that, and it was the top-rated comment. Nobody had disliked it, had a lot of likes on it. But when it came down, the most liked comment below it was, "Legalize marijuana and the drug cartels will be pharmaceutical reps. Problem solved." So I decided that maybe this was just one of the administrators believing we need to legalize drugs, and this was their way of getting their position elevated.
That could very well be. That makes a lot of sense. And sadly, we have reached the end of the show. So I always like to.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Yes, I enjoyed having you on. I think this is one of our one of the more fun times that I've had doing a show, because you are highly articulate and very intelligent, and I appreciate the books. They're really good, really, really good.
Thank you so much.
Yep, you're most welcome. And I'm going to finish reading this book, and then I'm going to start reading Secession 2041 to find out what happens next.
Great.
So, anyways, Mike, thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate it. The show will be available as an MP3 on USSAMichigan.com, along with the show notes that I have been showing on the screen all night, along with the links and everything. The show in its entirety will be up on YouTube as a video presentation. And, Mike, I appreciate you coming on the show. And what else can I say? I mean, it was a great time that I had.
It was a really great discussion. I loved your questions, loved the discussion, loved the debate, and really appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, thank you for being on the show. Have a good evening.